Hello YouTube. Bane666 here. I came across this article by Catherine Cox, called Female Genital Mutilation vs. Circumcision. Well, we've only seen the title so far, and already she is making a distinction between male genital mutilation and female genital mutilation. Oh, and the picture of the carving knife is just all class. But let's continue. This post may get a bit graphic, so if you have a weak stomach, and or are under the age of 14, I might recommend you stop here. Someone recently asked me what feminists thought about male circumcision. I thought that there's no way I can even broach the subject without bringing up female circumcision and the various feelings feminists have on that subject, too. As some of you who have watched my past videos may guess, I'm against genital mutilation, and that's regardless of whether someone is male or female. But having read quite a few articles and comments on the subject, there is one thing I've noticed, and that is if the topic is female genital mutilation, and someone brings up male genital mutilation, then they are accused of hijacking or derailing the conversation, yet every time male genital mutilation is brought up, it seems we can't discuss it without also discussing female genital mutilation. In other words, when discussing female mistreatment, we are not allowed to discuss male mistreatment, but we can't discuss male mistreatment without discussing female mistreatment. Catherine Cox, the author of this article, was asked about male genital mutilation, but instead of simply saying that she agrees or disagrees with it, she is going to give us a lesson on how females have it worse, because male suffering or mistreatment, it seems, can't be discussed unless put in context with that females eternally have it worse. Next. First of all, let it be known that in the later half of the 20th century, there was a lot of hullabaloo about how circumcision was just mutilation, no matter what sex the baby was. Statistics showed that men who were uncircumcised in countries such as Sweden, where uncircumcised penises are the norm, are much less likely to have urinary tract infections, etc. The argument therein was that circumcision held absolutely no benefits for boys, and that, unless you had a religious reason to do it, it was ridiculous to subject your child to that kind of mutilation. Especially because cutting off the foreskin takes away some of the sensation and pleasure that a man gets out of his wee-wee later in life. Okay, so far so good, although I suspect when she starts to discuss female genital mutilation, she won't be using the female equivalent term to wee-wee. Next. Nowadays, new studies have shown that circumcised men are less likely to spread HIV/AIDS, HPV genital herpes, and other rather serious sexually transmitted diseases than their uncut counterparts. This is particularly notable in places like Africa, where HIV/AIDS is a serious plague. And here we have her first bullshit claim.
Circumcision, one of the big arguments touted out recently is that it provides a prophylactic effect, a beneficial effect in that it prevents HIV, but only to 60%. The problem with those studies is severalfold. One is they're African studies, and African culture and American culture is very distinct. And although I get involved in the issue in Africa, I'm much more worried about the fact that the African studies and experience will be used to recreate a marketing system for circumcision in the U.S. and halt all the efforts of those of us over the years to bring the circumcision rates down. The other reason that circumcision is not the perfect panacea for HIV is, first of all, 60% is a very poor showing for any immunity. No drug could claim to be an immunization or a preventative against a drug if it's against a disease if it only provides 60% protection, because that means it's basically what I like to call virulent. It's a way of just postponing the incidence of the disease until the inevitable will occur statistically. So even proponents of circumcision for Africa say that men will still have to use condoms. And my argument is, well, if they still have to use condoms, why don't they start out with condoms in the beginning? Why are we doing the circumcision? And the other thing is cost, of course. The cost to impose circumcision on Africans to solve HIV infections is horrific. And those circumcisions will be done on the cheap by practitioners who are not medically trained, in bush settings where there's not even clean water. And I predict the morbidity, the secondary problems and infections from that will be awful. Far more draining of resources for HIV than would be just very good campaigns.
I think it's important to recognize what the random control trials in Africa did and didn't do. And I think that they did show that there is some efficacy in circumcision to reduce the risk of HIV. But that's very different from saying that this is going to be an effective measure in the prevention of HIV. Efficacy is a term of art in epidemiology. And what that means is that under the very narrow confines of a random control trial, your hoped for and expected outcome was in fact realized, at least within the 18 months or 22 months in the case of one of the other trials, that there was some efficacy. The problem here is that efficacy and effectiveness, another term of art in epidemiology, aren't the same thing. We had Michelle Guerin and John Talbot do studies that showed that the effectiveness of circumcision was not likely to be seen. And that is to say, demographically, you roll this out and you aren't going to get the protective effect that you seem to see in the RCTs. And what Guerin said was, when you look at population levels, you don't see the protective effect across large groups of people. And I think he named at least 5 of 13 of the southern African countries where circumcised men had higher rates of HIV than intact men. John Talbot, on the other hand, said that if you controlled for sex workers, the number of sex workers, the levels of infection, that sort of thing, you would ultimately find that the protective effect in the countries where circumcised men had lower rates of HIV would essentially disappear. So I try to use all the techniques that's within my understanding to make it very findable and very discoverable through Google and Yahoo Search and all of those different search engines. You can trace all of the researchers in the HIV area who focused on circumcision to prior efforts to promote circumcision. Most of them, if not all of them, had no prior interest in HIV until they figured out they could hang their promotion of circumcision on that cause. I think it's also important to realize that there are massive amounts of money being injected into the HIV arena, and this is an area where they can get, and have gotten actually, massive amounts of money to promote this singular interest of theirs. When the WHO and UNAIDS recommended circumcision, they did so for adults and only adults, emphasizing such things as needing to make it a comprehensive package, needing to make sure that there's informed consent, paying attention to disinhibition, trying to dissuade individuals from believing they're immune, that kind of thing after the procedure. And clearly that is not what happened immediately after. What you heard were calls for infant circumcision. And clearly those people calling for infant circumcision are doing it from a very opportunistic point of view. I'm aware of this one particular doctor, Neil Falak, in Vancouver, in Canada. And I understand that at a time when there was a child death there, a child by the name of Riley McWillis, he used that opportunity to pitch his services, claims to have a bloodless, painless circumcision technique, claims to be a specialist in infant circumcision. And a guy who's never had any interest whatsoever in HIV is suddenly flying off to Africa to teach this technique and claiming in his own promotional materials that he's saving Africa. I think is an example of the rawest form of opportunism. If you make claims of being some great savior, for a disease that you've hitherto never really had any interest in until it intersected with your particular interest in infant circumcision, I think that's just going way over the top. And I just don't see how there could ever be any bloodless, painless technique of infant circumcision when you're essentially slicing off a portion of a child's penis. How could that be painless, and how could that be bloodless? that's sloganeering. That's coming up with a slogan to sell your services. It's not doing anything to promote the protection of individuals against HIV.
Let's talk about circumcision in Africa and all the news people have heard about circumcision possibly preventing transmission of AIDS. I've been to just about every country in Africa, and I can tell you something. Silly would be a compliment. We can't deliver 50 cents worth of tetracycline to save blindness. We can't deliver food or fresh water. Africa is a very different place. The idea that we Westerners are going to march into Africa, which is so huge, so vast, so complicated, and we're going to circumcise, perform an operation on millions and millions and millions of men when we refuse to feed these people, get them useful jobs, and bring them fresh water, is so naive that it expresses to me the desperation of the pro-circumcision lobby. And I don't know how to attack it. There's just so many ways of going about this. One is like the secondhand smoke issue. It's about human courtesy and just go at it at a point of view from practicality. As I said, I've been to Africa. Men there who have been told this, who hear this, figure, aha, I'll get a circumcision. I don't need to use condoms. Why would any man line up and lay his penis on the table to get it chopped if he didn't think there was a major, plus, namely not having to use condoms? Because you can already use condoms. If you're so afraid of HIV, every man in Africa would use condoms. So the unexpected consequences of this will be to increase the spread of AIDS. I can give you a lot of examples how we've done this in medicine and not seen the unexpected consequence, which comes back to bite us in the butt. And this will be one of them. The transmission rate of AIDS is higher after the circumcision in men for a period of time. The studies have been done in a very, very select group of men by major, fantastic, high-quality, hygienic facilities with doctors who really want to prove their case. These men are lectured about condoms. These men are lectured about AIDS prevention. It's not what it would be like if we started to do this routinely.
After all, there are several nations now. Lesotho is one, I think. Tanzania is one. Thailand is one, where government campaigns for 100% condom usage 100% of the time have shown dramatic reductions in HIV of the kind that circumcision could never show. The other thing that women who are viewing this should consider is that the only protection that circumcision is alleged to provide, and this is even by its proponents, is to the male, not to the female.
The best way to stop the spread of AIDS is by promoting condom usage. Suggesting that preventative surgery is a solution, when there is an easier, cheaper and more effective means of prevention, is crazy. I don't believe the African studies are credible, but let me play devil's advocate, and for argument's sake accept them. If we justify the circumcision of newborns against their will, based on a slight increase in AIDS prevention, then should we not force mastectomies on all teenage girls, based on the chance that one day they might get breast cancer? Let's face it, breast cancer kills large numbers of women worldwide every year. Shouldn't we try to bring down that number by forcibly performing operations on young girls? Crazy argument, right? Using condoms is an effective way to fight the spread of AIDS. Circumcision is not. It is, however, an effective way for some people to make a ton of money, but I'm sure that's not a motivator, right? Next. Furthermore, the part of the penis that is cut during male circumcision is not necessarily important to the functioning of male pleasure centers, and a man without a foreskin is technically intact. Rates of infection after circumcision are really low, and most men have the process done when they're so young that they won't remember. I do have a friend who got circumcised when he was in his 20s, per Taiwanese tradition, but I'm pretty sure he's a rarity. Let's break this down, shall we? First claim. Furthermore, the part of the penis that is cut during male circumcision is not necessarily important to the functioning of male pleasure centers, and a man without a foreskin is technically intact. Of course, this is clearly false.
Well, the thing that struck me about it was the similarity with the fingertip. with the high level of innervation, lots of sensory tissue, and the fact that it was far more complicated than just a simple extension of the shaft skin of the penis, which is what most people say it is, that it's a flap extended over the glands to protect the glands. It is not. I would regard it as an organ in its own right because it has at least two major functions. The first function is mechanical. It provides a rolling bearing on the penis, which you wouldn't have otherwise. It also provides the extra tissue required for changes of size. The penis does get bigger, and if the skin was a fixed size, then a good deal of discomfort would result in a huge amount of stretching to accommodate the doubling in size that occurs with erection. So that the foreskin provides accommodation, I guess is the word we would use to describe changes in size. The second major function is its sensory function. It has become very evident to us over the last 15 years or so. I'm trying to think when John Taylor and his team came out with their findings in the early 90s, that the realization has come upon us, even if people didn't stop to think about what they were feeling themselves if they were intact. I certainly didn't. I didn't really sit down to analyze what I was feeling. But the microscope disclosed to us that the foreskin is heavily sensory in its function. I would believe, well, it is my belief, that it has the highest concentration of sensory nerve endings anywhere on the male body. So it can't be ignored, it can't be described as a simple piece of skin.
The glands or the head of the penis was more sensitive to light touch in the person that had not been circumcised than in the one that had. That made perfect sense because the non-circumcised penis is covered most of the time and is in a relatively moist environment, just like the inside of your mouth is more sensitive than the outside. The inside of the mouth is more sensitive than the outside of the lip. And you can measure that. So that wasn't really very surprising. The really interesting thing that when you organize the statistics, and it varied a great deal, I will say, because each person differs from another in terms of the sensitivity. But when you analyze the data, and we had statisticians analyzing the data for us, that the most sensitive areas of the penis were in the prepuce or the foreskin. That the most sensitive areas of the uncircumcised penis were more sensitive than the most sensitive area of the circumcised penis. Inevitably. So not only was the head of the penis less sensitive to touch, the most sensitive area of all was the area of the foreskin which is totally missing in the circumcised male, where the foreskin folds back over itself to form back under covering the glands. And that area was exquisitely sensitive. It's, say, more sensitive than any area on the circumcised penis, statistically. Very interesting.
The specialized sensory tissue that I've been describing is really quite fascinating. The skin of the penis is zipped up, just like an ordinary zip, on the underside, as the layers of cells develop in the embryo, and that we call the raphe, that little line, the seam which goes up, and at the top of the penis it becomes the little bridge, the frenulum, which is Latin meaning a little bridle, actually. Frenum is a bridle, a horse's bridle, and a frenulum is a little bridle. And that tethers the foreskin onto the base of the glands on the underside. Now, for many years, people thought that was the only real specialization that had occurred, that it was a leftover of this process of zipping all the skin up as it was developed. But now we realize that this amazing concentration of nerve endings is related to that frenulum, and from the frenulum, draping away to each side, is a band of ridges, folds in the skin, which John Taylor has called the ridged band. There are about 11 or 12 ridges, and they are very similar to the ridges on the fingers, on the fingertip, and they run right round the entire diameter of the penis and rise up into the frenulum, and they enclose in the inner foreskin a delta, a triangle of skin, which we've called the frenular delta, below the frenulum, which is exquisitely innervated, and most men know this as their own G-spot, the spot that is the most sensitive area of the penis. In that area, in the ridged band and in the frenular delta, we have the same specialist nerve endings that we have in the fingertip, only we have probably 10 times as many, I would believe. The number hasn't been accurately counted yet, but the number of nerve bundles that wire them up is known, and it's very impressive. So the foreskin is undoubtedly the main sensory unit of the penis.
So the foreskin is the most sensitive part of the penis. Hardly, not necessarily important, as Catherine Cox claims. But let's look at her next claim. Rates of infection after circumcision are really low, and most men have the process done when they're so young that they won't remember. Okay, let's deal with the too young to remember claim first. Once again, if I were to play devil's advocate, could the too young to remember claim be used to excuse other forms of child abuse, like putting lit cigarettes out on your baby? Too young to remember, right? What about something like this?
Vanessa George had been working with children for a decade. She had passed all the required checks. She was married with 2 teenage daughters. But secretly, she was a paedophile, sexually abusing babies and toddlers, taking photographs of that abuse on her mobile phone and sending the images to others. Some of the pictures categorized by police as being the worst level of child pornography.
Do you think the parents of the babies she molested would be happy with the too young to remember argument? Somehow I think not. To be perfectly honest, I think the too young to remember argument is a pile of shit. Considering that children, from the time they are born, are like little sponges absorbing everything around them, I think it's a reasonable argument to make that cutting off a part of their body with 10 times the nerves as your fingertips, in most cases without any anesthesia, is going to have some psychological effect on that child's development. The adult may not consciously remember the experience, but that does not mean it did not have a subconscious psychological effect. Infant pain and behavioral response to circumcision. To understand the long-term effects of circumcision, it is necessary to review the effects on the infant. The question of infant pain is often raised in debates about circumcision. Some physicians believe early work claiming that the newborn nervous system is not sufficiently developed to register or transmit pain impulses. According to more recent work, this belief is the major myth of physicians regarding infant pain. That babies cannot physically resist and stop the circumcision procedure also makes it easier to dismiss their pain. Some doctors minimize circumcision pain by calling it discomfort or comparing it to the pain of an injection, although these studies have been refuted by empirical studies. Anatomical, neurochemical, physiological and behavioral studies confirm that newborn responses to pain are similar to but greater than those in adult subjects. Infants circumcised with no anesthesia, reflecting common practice, experience not only great pain, but also an increased risk of choking and difficulty in breathing. Increases in heart rate of 55 bpm have been recorded, that is 1.5 times the baseline rate. After circumcision, the level of blood cortisol increased by a factor of 3 to 4 times the level before circumcision. As a surgical procedure, circumcision has been described as among the most painful performed in neonatal medicine. Investigators reported, this level of pain would not be tolerated by older patients. Using a pacifier during circumcision reduced crying but did not affect the hormonal pain response. An infant may also go into a state of shock to escape the overwhelming pain. Therefore, while crying may be absent, other body signals show that severe pain is always present during circumcision. Behavioral changes in infants resulting from circumcision are very common, and can interfere with parent-infant bonding and feeding. The American Academy of Pediatrics Task Force on Circumcision notes increased irritability, varying sleep patterns and changes in infant-maternal interaction after circumcision. Canadian investigators report that during vaccinations at age 4 to 6 months, circumcised boys had an increased behavioral pain response and cried for significantly longer periods than did intact boys. The authors believe that circumcision may produce long-lasting changes in infant pain behavior. That study suggests that circumcision may permanently alter the structure and function of developing neural pathways. So I think it's pretty clear that the "too young to remember" argument is bullshit. What about the rates of infection being really low and other complications?
There really is no consistency in circumcision and how it's done, the operative technique. There are recommendations and guidelines, but you're dealing with something so small, and differences in using clamps, and there's a method that's used in the Brit Milah in Jewish ceremonies. There's a freehand technique, and it goes on and on and on. Consequently, there are horrible tragedies that you hear about. We sweep them under the rug as we do in other areas in medicine because we say the greater good is served. So if I'm going to do a heart operation to save your life and some people die, we kind of accept that. To me, it's a balance of, you weigh the benefits and the risks in all medical procedures. I don't care whether it's a drug or an operation or whatever. You have to weigh the benefits and the risks, and we can get very impractical about that. If we were honest with ourselves, we have to admit that many of the preventive tests that we have to do on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people to prevent a single case. And I could say that about some of our biggest killers, but those are killers. In this particular regard, what is a tolerable side effect rate? How many young boys is it tolerable have to lose their penises altogether from botched circumcisions? A little bleeding, a little infection, a little trauma, we kind of tolerate it. The actual side effect rate is not known. These are not reportable. We certainly know when major things happen. And the other side of it, ranging from even when a circumcision is done perfectly by those criteria, there are side effects that we all now are learning in terms of functionality and what it means to a man and his sexuality. As well as a lot of men, when too much skin is taken off, there's a tension. There isn't enough skin for normal erection, and you can get irritation and tears, etc. Self-induced during masturbatory activity or during intercourse. After all, the foreskin was put there by God, and it has a function, or in Mother Nature, depending upon one's particular belief. So the variability is interesting, and often is not really talked about, because that variability, to me, should open the door to why this operation, needs to be abandoned for medical and also ethical reasons.
Circumcision accidents, of course they exist, and quite frankly, circumcision deaths even in the U.S. are drastically understated, because no one wants to admit. Think about this setting. Typically, a circumcision is done by a first-year resident or a second-year resident with somebody else watching. The old rule was watch one, do one, teach one. And so a lot of circumcisions are performed by very, very young physicians in training, and this may be their very first surgery. You can't expect a 100% success rate, even if somebody is hovering over helping them out. So yes, there are lots of accidents, and the answer to why we don't know about more of them is, quite frankly, they're nicely covered up. The child's death or the child's injury is coded as a blood problem, a liver enzyme problem, an intestinal problem, a heart problem. Something other than circumcision. And so when the death is coded, it's coded as ischemia, blood loss, exsanguination. So the child lost blood. And maybe later on in the analysis you'll see secondary to circumcision. Well, actually the child died of circumcision, frankly. Died of a procedure that was botched or a procedure that wasn't well attended. And so the notion that nothing ever happens and this is an extremely risk-free surgery is a very popular one, but doesn't happen to be an accurate one. No one really knows the death rate in the U.S. for circumcisions. I think the American Academy of Pediatrics puts it at 0.6 in 100,000 or something, but it's much, much higher than that, significantly higher than that. We estimate several hundred deaths a year. And that death might not occur immediately, of course. It might be an infection death weeks later, all sorts of things that can happen. I've been involved in 2 death cases now, and if I'm involved in 2, how many are there? One was in Vancouver, BC, of a boy named Riley McWillis, who bled to death in his parents' care for the simple reason that they had dressed him in a modern diaper whose chemicals hide any kind of moisture. And I have often used in lecture a diaper of the infant size to show that I can hide the quantity of bridge paint in a diaper that you would never see that would kill a child. People don't realize that a neonate of 4 kilos, about 8.8 pounds, only has 12 ounces of blood. The loss of 2.5 ounces of that blood will lead to hypovolemic shock, that is, death by lack of blood pressure for the heart to function against. And so there's very little. 2.5 ounces of blood is about 1/3 of a cup of coffee. That's not very much blood, easily hidden. So for instance, I'm completely opposed to outpatient circumcisions where there's no period of observation, because that puts the child at risk for exsanguination in the hands of non-professionals who can't possibly judge what a serious quantity of blood loss is for a neonate. And yet, of course, outpatient circumcisions are extremely common, especially, I might add, in Western Canada.
So not only does male circumcision cause great pain and lead to a loss of sexual pleasure, but in extreme cases it can lead to deformity, infection, and even death. Remember, the surgery performs no benefit to a normal healthy male child. But Catherine Cox has one more claim in this paragraph, which is, I do have a friend who got circumcised when he was in his 20s, per Taiwanese tradition, but I'm pretty sure he's a rarity. I'm no expert on Taiwanese culture, but going by Miss Cox's words here, if it is part of Taiwanese tradition, then I doubt it would be a rarity, at least in the Taiwanese community. But let's use the magic Google machine and find out. Doing a quick search, I found that circumcision is only practiced today by a minority of Aboriginal Taiwanese. But they are not the only ones who circumcise teens and young adults. Some of you may have seen 2 videos I made earlier this year about circumcision. Links below. One involved a 14-year-old boy being forcibly held down and circumcised in a backyard, by a witch doctor, as a South Pacific custom apparently. The teenager was hospitalized. The other video involved 3 teenage boys being airlifted to hospital, after a botched circumcision performed by Australian Aboriginal elders. I won't go into any more detail about these 2 stories here, but I do recommend you watch my 2 previous videos on the subject, as this will be important for part 2 of this series. Yes, that's right, I'm ending this video here, and continuing it in at least one more part, possibly 2, as I have had issues rendering long videos lately. And this one is already past the 30-minute mark. So until next time, remember folks, don't drink the poison Kool-Aid.
Where are you from?
Uganda.
What's your role in the conference?
I've come to speak about the role of mobile technology in turning the tide on HIV/AIDS on behalf of Checks to Change.
What kind of... Oh, really? Okay,
yeah,
great.
Yeah.
What do you think of... We've been asking people, what do you think of circumcision as HIV prevention?
Yeah, we've also done mobile technology programs on circumcision and turning the tide on HIV/AIDS, and we found that, of course, people are misunderstanding it, that as long as I'm circumcised, then I won't get HIV/AIDS. But no, we're trying to tell them that circumcision reduces the risk of contracting HIV/AIDS.
But you still have to wear a condom.
Yes.
So if you have to wear a condom, what's the point of being circumcised?
It says that there's a certain percentage that it reduces the risk.
Even if they're wearing a condom?
Yes.
Or is it only if they're not wearing a condom?
if they're wearing a condom, even when they're not wearing a condom.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So it only helps if you're not wearing a condom.
It can help to a certain extent. Your risks are lower.
Right. But if you're wearing a condom, it's worthless.
It's still the same. It's still the same. But when you don't wear a condom and you're circumcised, the risks of contracting the HIV
so if you're gonna wear a condom, there's no point to getting circumcised. Is that true?
I wouldn't say so.
Why?
I wouldn't say so. But at all times, I would still say wear a condom.
No. Oh yeah, I know. But if you're gonna wear a condom, there's no point in being circumcised. Don't get circumcised, right?
Yeah, but in Africa it's different.
When people go in for circumcision, do you tell them about the sexual problems that circumcision can cause?
Yes, we do, and then we remind them on how to treat their wound and not to
you tell them that it can cause a significant loss of sexual pleasure?
No, it doesn't. Actually, in Africa, it's even it sells more when you're circumcised than when you're
really?
not. Yeah.
Is that a scientific study?
No, but it's
well, did you? What if I told you there was a study of 10,000 men and their partners in Denmark last year that showed that circumcised
Denmark, in Africa,
that showed that circumcised men were several times more likely to have problems in their partners reaching orgasm.
I think if it's not done well, but for us, I think in Africa, actually from long time ago, traditionally, the men are preferred to be circumcised.
But you know that
for health purposes.
Yeah, well, they do that to girls in a lot of countries too, though, right?
Yeah, they also do it to girls, but we are trying to reduce that as well because
so
actually that is spreading HIV.
But you know that also circumcising men in unsterile conditions also increases HIV.
Yes.
So why don't we try to reduce that too?
I don't know.
Doesn't it seem a little biased? Doesn't it seem a little sexist?
No.
No?
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't?
It doesn't.
Really? Why not?
I don't think so.
Should we do studies to see if female circumcision, when done in sterile environments, also reduces HIV?
No.
Why not?
I think it's very inhuman to really circumcise females.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
But it's not inhuman to circumcise males?
No, it's not.
And you don't find that sexist at all?
No, I don't.
What if I told you that there was a study that showed circumcision amputates the 5 most sensitive parts of the penis, including thousands of erogenous nerve endings?
It depends on the way you do it.
But you don't think the same is true for female circumcision?
No, it's not, because what happens to the female circumcision, why it is done in a certain culture in Uganda, is that they want to stop the women from sleeping around.
What if I told you that the main purpose of male circumcision was also to reduce sexual pleasure?
No, it's not. It's actually mainly for health purposes and to be able
to...
Yeah.
Health purposes?
Yes.
So you think it's health? You think it was healthy to get circumcised with a dirty knife in the bush?
That's funny.